Well, good morning, kids. I hope you guys have had a pretty good week and are ready to worship God tomorrow. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get into our passage for this morning because it's one of the most famous stories in the Bible, yet there's a lot we have to talk about it, and I think you can learn from it. We're in chapter 3. Now, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why this bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then God goes on to tell Moses that he's going to send Moses to Pharaoh to live up to his name, to be the one who pulls the people out of Egypt. Now, put yourself in Moses' position. He's about 80 years old right now. He's settled down into the wilderness and the life of a shepherd. Now, at this point, Egypt is probably a distant, fading memory. And I'm sure he has no hope of being the people's savior and deliverer anymore. Then one day, his day starts out like normal, like your Saturday did today. And he's watching the sheep and he's moving them from grazing land to grazing land. And then he notices a bush that's burning. And maybe he doesn't think anything of it at first because he's probably seen a lot of burning bushes in the desert. It's pretty dry there. But then again, he keeps watching and the bush isn't burning up. So he decides to walk over to it. And all of a sudden, the bush starts talking to him. The bush knows his name. The bush introduces itself as God and tells Moses that he's supposed to go back to Egypt to free and deliver the Hebrews from Pharaoh. Now, how do you think that would have hit you? Perhaps you fancied yourself a deliverer when you were younger, but now that you're older than most of your grandparents are, you don't really think so much of it anymore. I mean, even at age 40, Moses was not exactly in the prime of life. And with each passing year in the wilderness, that dream had faded more and more into a distant memory. So you've become set in your ways. And then seemingly out of the blue, a bush starts talking to you and says, Come, I will send you up to Pharaoh, and you will bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. I don't think any of us would have been up for that. Well, I wonder if this kind of stuff actually doesn't happen to us more than we realize. You know, most of you are too young to have thought yourself invincible and then failed big time. But if you haven't, you will eventually. Now, it's not often as dramatic as what we just read about here, but at the same time, you will have grand ideas of what you think you can do for God and your home with your own personal holiness, your career, the world around you. And then the circumstances of God's providence will blindside you and kind of settle you down a little bit. About 15 years ago, I went to live in China as a missionary. And I had grand ideas about what I was going to do for God there. I was a scientist, so I could win any argument. And I knew that I could convince any atheist that God, the God of the Bible, actually existed and Jesus was God in the flesh. So I burst upon my university campus ready to be the next Hudson Taylor, who was a great missionary to the Chinese people, if you don't know who that guy was. And I failed pretty big time, pretty miserably. When my team and I hit the 5-month mark of being in China, everyone else had seen at least half a dozen people become Christians because of their ministry. I had seen 0. I almost asked if I could leave and just go home. I had had to be settled down. And I had given up, really, of thinking that I could do anything. I was convinced that I wasn't going to be the next Hudson Taylor. I was actually more like Taylor the failure. That's where we find Moses. And then God says, Here, I have this for you. You're old, you're frail, and you long gave up the delusions of being a liberator. Now you're ready to be the one that I'm going to use to pull the people out. I think most of us would have probably said, no. I don't think so, God. That's what Moses thought. And next week, we will see how God changes Moses from Moses to the failure to Moses the Savior by his grace alone. In the meantime, as you're thinking about it this weekend, remember, God's never done with you. No matter what you've done, no matter how big you've failed, just like he was never done with Moses, just like he wasn't done with me. You will one day crash and burn big time because of your own pride. And that may be the very moment when God comes to you and says, now you're ready. So you guys think about that, and I'll see you Monday.